Heyo YouTube, Flowcat here, and today I'm going to be starting a new playlist on my channel. This playlist is going to be called Let's Talk Genshin Impact, and this playlist will include videos about speculations, theories of mine, or really anything that I want to talk about related to Genshin Impact. Obviously, these videos will be discussion oriented, so I would love to see your feedback and engage with you in the comments below, but with no further ado, smack that like button and let's get right into it. Welcome to the video, and for the first video in this playlist, I'm going to be covering my Dendro speculations. Why Dendro speculations? Well, after doing a lot of team building and studying the elemental systems within Genshin, you kind of learn that it's sort of like physics. And using the knowledge that we already have in Genshin Impact, I believe it's entirely possible to show what Dendro will do when it releases as a playable element. Now obviously this is all speculation on my end. I have no way of proving exactly what Dendro will be like when it releases, but I very strongly believe that I'm either very close to being right or almost exactly right on my speculations. The point of getting this video out now is just so that I can do it ahead of the Dendro release and get my thoughts out early. One final note, I just wanted to mention that these videos will not be scripted. To be more genuine and authentic with my thoughts in these videos, to keep them more of like a discussion vibe, I've outlined this video as well as the points I'm going to make, and I'll try to be as concise as possible, but I just wanted to mention that. So, what does Dendro do? That is the question, isn't it? I'm sure many of you are aware that we already have some Dendro enemies in game, and some of those enemies are slimes. The big Dendro slimes have a number of different abilities that they can use, but some of those abilities will apply Dendro to your character, causing you to lose HP consistently. For that reason, I believe that Dendro is going to have this as a base effect. Currently in-game, when Dendro is applied to you, this happens with no reactions, and I think we should expect a similar base effect for Dendro. This means that even without reactions, Dendro will likely have an effect similar to corrosion on the enemies. Now in the testing of the video that I showed you with the Dendro slime is not regenerating HP, so this is not life steal, it's just life drain. I think likely this base effect will not crit and will scale off of EM and unit level very similarly to Swirl. But now let's get into the really juicy stuff. What are the reactions going to be like? Over my many hours of thinking about this, I actually came up with a pretty simple way to explain it. I'm going to explain Dendro reaction using two meta teams that I think Dendro will change dramatically: Freeze and Overload. But before we even talk about teams, let's learn how Freeze works as a reaction. Voiceover Flowcat here. This enemy has Hydro applied to him, so we're gonna go ahead and freeze him, and now that he's standing on a platform of ice and not in the water, the Hydro element will slowly drain away from him, and he will unfreeze. That is, until the Cryo gives way from underneath him, and he touches the water again. You'll notice that the freeze will stay in place so long as the enemy is affected by both Hydro and Cryo, and the Cryo element covers up the Hydro element on the enemy. Now that we've discussed how freeze teams work, let's jump into the game and talk about team building and what Dendro will do for freeze teams. Alright, so here we are, and we're looking at one variation of a freeze team. You can build freeze teams in a variety of ways, but for the simplicity of this video, I'm just going to show two really common and popular methods of building a freeze team. The first of which is having one Hydro unit, two Cryo units, and an Anemo unit. The Hydro unit obviously does the Hydro application. The Cryo units are there for Cryo resonance, for the crit boosting, and for freeze. And then the Anemo unit is there to spread both elements and reduce resistances to amp damage. The next kind of freeze comp we're going to talk about is Hydro, Cryo, Cryo, Cryo. This is a style of freeze comp that's been really popularized by Shenhe's release. But the idea behind this comp is very simple. Apply Hydro, and then apply as much Cryo as possible to keep the enemies frozen at all times. So now let's talk about what will happen when we add Dendro to freeze teams. Note that I'll be using Traveler as the stand-in for the Dendro unit. So instead of the first team we were looking at, we might see something like this, again imagining that this is a Dendro unit. Now as we discussed, the base effect of Dendro is something that I expect to be like a life drain or a corrosion mechanic. But what exactly would the point of it be here? Well, knowing what we know about freeze and how it works so far, with cryo protecting the hydro aura, my prediction is that Dendro is going to go one layer deeper with the same concept. Essentially meaning that you'll start with Dendro, and then apply hydro, and then apply cryo, and the cryo will protect both the hydro and the Dendro. So in the traditional sense, there may not actually be a reaction for Dendro, hydro, and cryo at all. They may just simply stack, with cryo shielding both the elements. So when it comes to freeze comps in Dendro, I don't actually think that we are going to have a reaction. Instead, I think that permafreeze is going to get Dendro as a life drain option, so that while your enemies are permafrozen, you can start draining their HP. Sounds pretty good to me. We also might see rainbow comps become more popular with Dendro. In this case, we would have Hydro, Anemo, Dendro, and Cryo. You'll notice by using Anemo and Dendro in the same comp, we can have our VV shred as well as a potential life drain. The only thing we lose out on is the crit rate from Cryo Resonance. And this final freeze comp is also a rainbow comp. This will be Hydro, Cryo, Dendro, and Pyro. This may seem weird at first, but if Dendro, Hydro, and Cryo stack, then with Yoimiya, the first shot would melt, the second would vape, and the third would burn, potentially allowing you to do 3 different Pyro reactions in one auto attack string. I see a lot of potential for solo Pyro units with Dendro units, and then a Hydro and Cryo just to freeze the enemies in place, so that you can do all those reactions and burst the enemies down. Okay, so we're back from discussing what I think Dendro will do to the freeze meta. As we discussed, I don't think Dendro is going to react with these elements at all. Instead, I think it's just going to add life drain on top of the permafreeze mechanic that we already have. When it comes to Anemo, it's unclear whether Dendro will react and swirl, but if I had to guess, I would say probably not. But enough of that, let's jump into Overload team comps so that we can discuss how Dendro might react with Electro and Pyro. But first, let's just chat a little bit about how Overload works in Genshin Impact. Voice over Flowcat back once again. We're mostly used to Overload and how it throws enemies around, but one thing that's not talked about often is how Overload clears the elements from the field. As you can see, when I apply the Electro and then the Pyro, the elements vanish from the field. And the same thing happens if you do it in reverse. Now, applying a lot of Pyro, you can see it'll take multiple overloads to clear all of the Pyro from the enemy. Okay, and so now that we have an understanding of how Overload works, let's jump into the team building section and discuss what Dendro might do to Overload teams. Alright, here we are in the team building section. Up in front of us, I have an Overload team that I put together. This is a common composition for elements for Overload teams. You have 1 Hydro unit, 2 Electro units, and a Pyro unit. Another common composition for Overload teams is 1 Hydro unit, 2 Pyro units, and 1 Electro unit. You'll notice that there's less variation this time, and that's because the only way to make Overload viable in the meta is to stack it with another reaction, Vape. We looked at a little bit of footage earlier, but let's go into more detail now. These team compositions work because Electro and Hydro can exist simultaneously on an enemy. This means that when a Pyro unit attacks and the Pyro aura is applied, it reacts not just with the Electro aura, but also with the Hydro aura at the same time. This creates a simultaneous vaporize and overload reaction, commonly referred to as a vape-splode, or an oversplode, or a super mega death bomb extraordinaire. Either way, it does a lot of damage and it's really effective. So how might Dendro affect these comps? First, let me explain the reaction sequence as I see it happening for Dendro and Electro. Remember that my Traveler is the Dendro element. First, we'll apply Dendro to the element, and then this will start the life drain mechanic. We can then swap over to our Electro unit and do an Electro attack, which will trigger a reaction, maybe have some kind of explosion or other kind of stagger effect. And then both elements will clear, leaving a Pyro aura on the enemy. I say this as making sense because trees can often light on fire when struck by lightning. So now that the enemy is left with a Pyro aura, you can attack once again with your Electro unit, dealing overload damage and clearing both the Electro and Pyro aura to leave the enemy completely blank of all auras. From this point, you can apply Dendro once again, rotate back to your Electro character, do the Dendro Electro reaction to leave Pyro on the enemy, do an overload reaction to clear it, and just keep repeating this until the enemy is dead. The point of these comps would be to alternate between these two reactions as quickly as possible. Whatever the Dendro reaction is in Overload, you would be doing them back and forth as quickly as possible to try to deal reaction damage. I see this as adding a lot of potential damage to Electro teams, and also being pretty fun. But now let's talk about if we were to take this idea and add Hydro into the mix. What if we had Dendro, Hydro, and Electro? Based on my theory, you could apply the Dendro and then the Hydro, and they would coexist while the Dendro starts doing its life drain effect. And then applying Electro would do Electro Charge and this Dendro reaction at the same time. And since the Dendro Electro reaction clears the element into Pyro, which will then clear with the Hydro, you'll notice that this is very similar to the already existing Overload meta comps. Just instead of doing Vape and Overload, you were doing the Dendro reaction and Electro Charge. I think it's a very fitting way for it to work. And finally, just because I know it's on everyone's mind and I haven't covered it yet, Geo. What is Dendro gonna do with Geo? I mean, really, I'm not sure. Likely, it'll just be another crystallized reaction, because Geo is exceptionally good at clearing elements from enemies. It would make sense that we'd be able to crystallize it like the other elements in the game, unless it functions like Anemo does, and doesn't interact with Geo at all. For this one, I think we'll just have to wait and see, but I really don't think it's as important as the other ones. So yeah, that's gonna wrap up my first Let's Talk Genshin Impact video. We talked about Dendro reactions and what I think Dendro is going to do for Genshin Impact. I think this is going to boost Freeze and Overload teams into a whole new kind of meta. We may even see new Electro Charge teams or other really fun ideas that I can't come up with right now. Anyway, I hope this made sense to you guys. I tried my best to make this as concise as possible and easy to understand. Comment down below and let me know what you think of my theory and what you think Dendro is going to do for Genshin Impact. Do you think it's going to make things better? Do you think it's going to buff Electro? Tell me your thoughts in the comment section down below. Make sure to subscribe if you're new and join my Discord, link in the description. We've got a super active, friendly community in there. I'd love to chat with you in my server. And as always, stay healthy, stay hydrated, peace.